After 10 years of living in my house completely rent-free, my son and his wife won $100 million in the lottery. And that very same night, my daughter-in-law slammed the winning ticket onto my marble kitchen counter, glared right into my eyes, and told me to pack my bags. She said the house was hers now, and she was going to tear it down to build a mansion. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just stood there looking at the son I had sacrificed everything for and prepared the exact legal trap that would take every single penny away from them. But before we get into how I made them pay, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city you are watching from today. Your support means everything to me. Now let me tell you how the ultimate betrayal unfolded. It was a Tuesday evening. The rain was pouring hard against the large glass windows of my Bellevue, Washington home. The kind of cold, relentless Pacific Northwest rain that makes you want to stay close to the fireplace. I am 76 years old, a retired structural engineer, and these damp nights tend to make my old joints ache. I had just come up from the basement to brew a cup of decaf coffee. That is when Tiffany, my 38-year-old daughter-in-law, marched into the kitchen. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing like gunshots in the quiet house. My son Jason, who is 42, trailed closely behind her. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes were fixed firmly on the baseboards. He looked like a dog that had just been kicked, completely terrified and submissive to his wife. Tiffany did not say a word at first. She just walked right up to the kitchen island, a beautiful slab of imported marble that my late wife had picked out almost 20 years ago, and slammed a small piece of paper down on it. It was a Mega Millions lottery ticket. I looked down at the numbers printed on the paper. Then I looked up at the television screen playing the local news in the living room. The numbers matched perfectly. $100 million. I looked at Tiffany expecting to see tears of overwhelming joy. I expected a hug, or at least the kind of celebration that families share when their lives are changed forever. Instead, I saw pure, unadulterated venom in her eyes. Her lips curled into a nasty, arrogant sneer that made my stomach turn. "Pack your bags, Richard," she said. Her voice was ice cold, devoid of any respect, warmth, or basic humanity. "We won. We are rich. And I am finally done looking at your depressing face every single day. You have exactly 3 days to get your junk out of my house before I call a demolition crew to bulldoze this miserable shack." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My house. She called it her house. A miserable shack. This house was a $2.5 million waterfront property that I had spent my entire adult life paying off. I built the custom cedar deck out back with my own 2 hands. I reinforced the foundation myself. My wife and I raised Jason within these very walls. It held the echoes of our laughter, our holidays, our entire family history. And yet, for the last 10 years, I had been treated like an unwanted ghost in my own home. 10 years ago, Jason came to me in tears. His tech startup had completely collapsed. He was drowning in massive debt. His creditors were threatening to take absolutely everything, and Tiffany was threatening to divorce him. Being a father, my first and only instinct was to protect my boy. I told them to move in with me. I gave them the sprawling master suite. I gave them the top 3 floors of the house to live in completely free of charge so they could get back on their feet. I packed up my clothes, my favorite books, and the few precious photos of my late wife, and I moved myself down into the unfinished basement. I lived in that damp, dark basement for a whole decade so my son could live in luxury upstairs. I paid the expensive property taxes. I paid the sky-high utility bills. I even paid for the premium high-speed internet that Tiffany used to shop for designer handbags online all day while claiming she was looking for a job. I did it because that is what fathers do. You sacrifice. You endure the discomfort. You hope that one day your children will look at you with just a fraction of the love and gratitude you poured into them since the day they were born. But looking at Jason now standing there in a $300 cashmere sweater that I had paid for refusing to even make eye contact with his own father, I realized a cold, hard truth. I had not raised a man. I had raised a coward, and I had let a greedy, ungrateful parasite into my home. "Did you hear me, old man?" Tiffany snapped, breaking the heavy silence and pulling me forcefully back to the present moment. She tapped her manicured fingernail aggressively against the lottery ticket, scratching the marble. "I said, pack your bags. We are going to build a modern mega mansion right on this lot, and let me make this crystal clear. There is no mother-in-law suite for you in the new blueprints." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the warmth of my coffee mug in my hands. I kept my voice perfectly steady, drawing on decades of experience managing chaotic construction sites and dealing with hostile contractors. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me upset. "Tiffany," I said calmly, looking right past her to look at my son. "This is my house. My name is on the deed. You cannot kick me out of my own home. Jason, are you really going to let her speak to me like this?" Jason opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just looked away, retreating further into his shell. Tiffany threw her head back and let out a loud, mocking laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a neatly folded legal document, waving it in my face like a victory flag. "Oh, Richard," she smirked, her eyes gleaming with dark, absolute malice. "You really are getting senile, aren't you? You don't own this house anymore, old man." I stared at the paper she was shoving into my face. Printed in bold ink at the top were the words, "Quitclaim Deed." Below that was the seal of King County. And at the bottom, sitting on the signature line, was my name, Richard Thomas Holden. It was my handwriting. The loops and angles were unmistakably mine. According to this document, I had transferred the ownership of my waterfront property to Jason and Tiffany Holden, and I had done it for exactly $1. Tiffany traced her finger over my signature, a wicked smile on her lips. She looked like a predator that had trapped its prey. She told me I had signed my life away 4 weeks ago, and the county clerk recorded it yesterday. She laughed, boasting about how easy it was to trick a senile fool who trusted his pathetic son. I looked from the paper to Jason. He finally lifted his head and met my gaze for a second before looking away. He swallowed hard, offering no apology. He just stood there, letting his wife parade his betrayal like a trophy. Holding my coffee, my mind drifted back to a rainy Tuesday night last month. I was in the basement reading when I heard a timid knock. It was Jason. His eyes were red and puffy. He looked desperate. He came into my room holding a thick stack of legal documents attached to a clipboard. He sat heavily on my cot and began to cry real heavy tears. He told me a heartbreaking story. He said his new business was failing and the IRS was breathing down his neck. He needed a tax break to stay afloat. The only way to get it was if I signed Medicare supplementary insurance documents, declaring him as my financial caretaker. He sobbed, burying his face in his hands, telling me that if I did not sign these papers tonight, they would lose everything. He begged me to just sign the bottom of each page so he could overnight them to his accountant. A normal father would have signed immediately to save his child, but I am not a normal father. For 40 years, I was a structural engineer. I managed construction projects all over the country. I spent my career dealing with shady contractors and smooth-talking developers who would try to slip disastrous change orders into a massive stack of blueprints. You do not survive in that industry without developing a flawless sixth sense for deception. And that night, looking at my crying son, my instincts were screaming. The stack of papers was unusually thick for a medical declaration. I noticed how tightly Jason held the clipboard, keeping his hand clamped over the top half of the bottom pages, only exposing the signature lines. I told him I needed to get my reading glasses from my desk. I walked over, turning my back to him, and reached into my drawer. I grabbed a specific tool I used heavily in my drafting days instead of my regular pen. A friction pen. To the naked eye, the dark blue ink looks exactly like any standard pen. It flows smoothly and leaves a permanent-looking mark. But the ink in a friction pen is uniquely formulated to react to intense heat. If it reaches 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the chemical composition completely changes, and the ink turns entirely invisible. It vanishes without a trace, leaving the paper perfectly blank. I walked back to Jason. I used a standard pen to sign the first 2 pages, which were genuine medical forms. But when he hastily flipped to the pages hidden at the back, keeping the text covered with his palm, I smoothly swapped the pens. I used the friction pen to sign my name on those concealed documents. I did not know exactly what I was signing away that night, but I knew I was building a safety net. I knew that if those papers were ever put through a hot commercial scanner, my signature would evaporate into thin air. Looking at the photocopy of the quitclaim deed in Tiffany's hand, I knew exactly what my son had done. He weaponized my love to steal my home. Tiffany snatched the paper away, folding it and slipping it into her designer bag. She crossed her arms, looking around my beautiful kitchen, as if she was already measuring the walls for demolition. She told Jason to call the contractors tomorrow morning. She wanted the cedar deck torn down by Friday. She wanted my basement cleared out immediately so they could bring in heavy machinery. She spoke as if I was already gone, a nuisance that had finally been swatted away. I took a sip of my coffee. I let my shoulders droop. I made my hands tremble just a little bit. I forced the exhaustion of a defeated old man into my voice. I looked at her with pleading eyes. "Tiffany," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "Please, I am an old man. I have nowhere to go tonight. All of my wife's belongings, all of our precious memories, they are packed in heavy boxes down there. I cannot move them in the dark. Please just give me 3 days. 3 days to pack up my life, rent a small storage unit, and find a cheap motel room. That is all I ask. Just 3 days." Tiffany looked at me, her eyes narrowing as she weighed the inconvenience of my presence against the absolute joy of watching me beg. She glanced at Jason, who nodded weakly, eager to avoid any further confrontation. She turned back to me, a cruel sneer spreading across her face. "Fine," she spat, her voice dripping with disgust. "You have 3 days, Richard. Exactly 72 hours. If your junk is not out of my house by Friday evening, I am having the garbage men haul it straight to the dump. And do not even think about asking for a single dime of our lottery money to pay for your cheap motel." She turned on her heel and strutted out of the kitchen, Jason following obediently behind her like a shadow. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to their footsteps retreating up the stairs. The moment I heard their bedroom door click shut, my trembling hands became perfectly steady. I set my coffee mug down on the cool marble counter. I did not need 3 days to pack my bags. I needed 3 days to spring a legal trap that would absolutely destroy them. I walked slowly toward the basement door, deliberately making my footsteps sound heavy and burdened on the wooden stairs. I knew Jason and Tiffany were probably listening from the top of the landing, waiting to hear the pathetic sounds of a defeated old man dragging cardboard boxes across a concrete floor. I made sure to let out a long, weary sigh as I reached the bottom step. The basement was exactly as I had left it. It was a cold, sparsely furnished space smelling faintly of damp earth and old pine. My narrow cot sat in the corner covered with a thin quilt. Stacks of plastic storage bins lined the walls, holding the remnants of a life that once filled the entire house above me. But I had absolutely no intention of opening a single one of those boxes tonight. I did not touch the packing tape. I did not reach for the bubble wrap. Instead, I walked straight past the tower of moving supplies and headed directly for my small metal desk tucked away in the darkest corner of the room. I reached under the desk, feeling for the small, heavy lockbox bolted to the bottom of the drawer. I entered the combination with practiced precision. The metal latch clicked open. Inside was a sleek, high-performance laptop that Tiffany and Jason knew absolutely nothing about. They thought my only connection to the outside world was an ancient, dust-covered desktop computer that took 5 minutes to boot up. They believed I was just a clueless, technologically illiterate fossil who barely knew how to check his email. That assumption was their second biggest mistake. I pulled the laptop out, set it gently on the desk, and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated the dim corner of the basement, casting a cool blue glow across my face. I took a deep breath, feeling my pulse steady itself as I prepared to pull back the curtain on the monsters living under my roof. I clicked on a secure encrypted application hidden deep within the hard drive. A grid of 9 black squares appeared on the screen, waiting for the connection to establish. I had not installed these cameras out of sheer paranoia. I installed them exactly 6 months ago out of absolute necessity. It started with a silver tea set. It was a beautiful, ornate antique that belonged to my late wife's grandmother, a family heirloom that carried generations of memories. One Sunday afternoon, I went upstairs to polish it, only to find the glass display cabinet completely empty. When I politely asked Tiffany about it, she gaslit me without a second thought. She looked at me with faux pity and told me I was losing my mind. She said I must have misplaced it, or perhaps my memory was finally starting to fail me in my old age. Then it was my wife's pearl necklace. After that, a pair of vintage gold cufflinks disappeared from my dresser upstairs. Every time the answer was the same. A condescending smile, a roll of the eyes, and a suggestion that I needed to see a doctor for early-onset dementia. But I knew my mind was perfectly sharp. I knew I was being robbed blind in my own home. So I used my background in electrical engineering and building management to discreetly wire the upper floors of the house. I installed micro cameras in the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, and the home office. They were cleverly disguised inside smoke detectors embedded in the edges of picture frames and hidden behind ventilation grills. They recorded in crystal-clear high definition, capturing both audio and video feeding directly to a secure cloud server that only I could access. The loading icon spun for a few seconds before the grid on my screen flared to life, filling the 9 squares with live feeds from the floors above. I immediately maximized the camera positioned in the kitchen. The angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the marble island and the adjoining living area. There they were, the newly minted multimillionaires. Jason and Tiffany were practically dancing around the kitchen. The tension and fake submission Jason had displayed earlier were completely gone. He was laughing loudly, his face flushed with greed and adrenaline. Tiffany had already discarded her expensive designer jacket and was busy digging through the back of the refrigerator. She pulled out a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon champagne. It was a bottle I had specifically purchased and saved for Jason's college graduation years ago, but we had never opened it because he dropped out of his master's program. Now she was casually ripping the gold foil off the neck, treating my prized possession like cheap party liquor. The cork popped with a loud snap, echoing through the speakers of my laptop. The champagne frothed over the edge of the glass bottle, spilling onto the hardwood floor that I had painstakingly polished just last week. She did not care. She laughed, grabbing 2 crystal flutes from the overhead cabinet, and poured the bubbling golden liquid. She handed a glass to Jason, and they clinked them together in a triumphant toast. Watching them celebrate their sudden fortune on the grave of my dignity made a cold, hard knot form in my chest. They were toasting to my eviction. They were celebrating the fact that they had successfully manipulated a father who had sacrificed everything for them. I reached out and slowly dragged the volume slider up, filling the quiet basement with the sound of their arrogant laughter. Tiffany took a long sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with wicked satisfaction as she leaned against the counter. She smiled at Jason, wiping a drop of the expensive drink from her bottom lip, and proudly began to explain exactly how she had managed to get me to sign those papers without putting up a fight. What I heard next completely shattered my heart into pieces. Tiffany took another sip of her champagne, leaning heavily against the marble island, her face flushed with the terrifying mixture of alcohol and pure arrogance. Jason stared at her with a pathetic, awestruck expression, hanging onto her every word, as if she were a brilliant general recounting a victorious campaign. I watched her manicured fingers tap rhythmically against the glass. She began to laugh, a harsh sound that vibrated through my speakers and settled like ice in my veins. She told Jason that he was entirely too soft. Jason mumbled something quiet in agreement. Then Tiffany leaned in close to him, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that the high-definition microphone picked up with absolute clarity. She confessed that getting my signature on that fake deed was not just a matter of waiting for the right moment. It required preparation. She smiled as she explained that for the past 2 months, she had been systematically tampering with my evening tea. Every night right around 8, I would go into the kitchen to brew my chamomile. And every night, while my back was turned, she had been slipping crushed sleeping pills into my mug. My breath caught in my throat. I sat frozen in the dark basement, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in my wide, horrified eyes. Suddenly, the last 2 months of my life made terrifying sense. I had been experiencing spells of intense grogginess, waking up with a heavy fog clouding my brain. I had scheduled an appointment with my doctor. I spent weeks lying awake in the dark, fearing that I was losing my mind. But it was not age. It was not a disease. It was my own daughter-in-law slowly poisoning me under my own roof. She proudly detailed how she had started with a mild dosage, just enough to make me pliant, and gradually increased it in the days leading up to the night Jason presented the fake medical documents. She wanted me exhausted, disoriented, and completely stripped of my sharp judgment. Through the screen, I watched Jason pale slightly. His smile faltered, replaced by a fleeting look of genuine panic. He set his glass down on the counter. He looked at Tiffany, his voice trembling, as he offered a pathetic protest. He told her that was dangerous. He nervously rubbed the back of his neck, stammering that she could have caused a heart attack, that an overdose at my age could have been fatal, and that they could have gone to prison. He said he thought she had simply waited until I was tired, not actively drugged me. Tiffany absolutely did not flinch. Instead, her eyes narrowed into dark, vicious slits. She slammed her champagne flute onto the marble island, the sharp sound making Jason physically flinch. She stepped into his personal space, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She called him a pathetic, spineless coward. She asked him if he honestly believed my sharp, stubborn mind would have signed away a multi-million-dollar property without reading every single clause if I had been fully coherent. She told him to stop whining like a frightened child and to appreciate the sacrifice she made to secure their future. She pointed a sharp finger directly at his chest, declaring that she was the only reason they were standing there with a winning ticket instead of drowning in his leftover business debt. She referred to me as a useless fossil, a stubborn roadblock, standing in the way of their happiness. She said I had lived long enough, and if a few crushed pills hurried along my natural decline, it was simply collateral damage. Jason looked down at his shoes, thoroughly humiliated, and instantly silenced. He nodded weakly, completely submitting to her twisted logic. The sheer evil radiating from my computer screen was almost physical. I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white, digging my fingernails into my palms to anchor myself to reality. I was living with monsters. But my anger was quickly overshadowed by cold focus as Tiffany smoothly transitioned from her monstrous confession to their next hurdle. She turned away from the cowering Jason and walked over to her designer handbag. She pulled out the winning lottery ticket and waved it in the air. Her demeanor shifted to purely businesslike. She reminded Jason that winning the lottery in Washington state came with a massive problem. State law strictly prohibits lottery winners from claiming their prizes anonymously. The moment they walked into the lottery headquarters to claim the money, their names and location would become public record. She told Jason that his former investors, the ones he abandoned during his bankruptcy, would immediately swarm them like vultures. They would be tied up in endless lawsuits and their privacy utterly destroyed. They needed a shield. They needed a way to mask their identity and claim the massive fortune without anyone ever connecting the money back to them. Jason looked up, his panic returning. He asked her how they were possibly going to avoid the public disclosure laws. Tiffany smiled that same wicked, triumphant smile. She walked back to the kitchen island, reaching into a hidden compartment of her bag. She pulled out a thick, faded blue folder. My heart skipped a sudden beat. I recognized that blue folder immediately. I had kept it securely filed away in my locked home office cabinet upstairs. It contained the foundational documents of a corporate entity I had built decades ago. Tiffany slammed the blue folder down on the marble counter right next to the winning lottery ticket and looked at Jason with eyes full of malicious brilliance. She told him that they were going to claim the money without anyone knowing. And then she delivered the final blow. She tapped her polished nail against the faded cover and said, "Good thing I found your dad's old company folder." I stared at the faded blue folder resting on the cold marble island. A wave of profound violation washed over me. That folder was not just a piece of stationery. It was a vault containing 20 years of my professional legacy. I had formed Holden Holdings, LLC, 2 decades ago during the peak of my career as a structural engineer. It was the corporate entity I used to manage the patents I held for specialized steel reinforcement joints. After I retired and the patents eventually expired, I let the company go dormant. I kept the paperwork locked inside the bottom drawer of my heavy oak filing cabinet upstairs. I kept it purely for sentimental reasons, a quiet reminder of the empire I had built and the respect I had commanded in the industry. Knowing that Tiffany had been creeping through my private office, picking the lock on my cabinet, and digging her greedy hands into my life's work made me feel physically ill. Through the laptop speakers, the rustling of thick paper filled the dark basement. Tiffany flipped the folder open, spreading the yellowed incorporation documents across the counter. She smoothed out the creases with her hands, her eyes scanning the legal jargon with hungry intensity. Jason leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed in confusion. He asked her what a dormant engineering company had to do with their lottery winnings. Tiffany sighed loudly, rolling her eyes as if dealing with a particularly slow child. She poured herself another generous glass of champagne and began to lecture him on the harsh realities of sudden wealth. She explained that winning the lottery was only the first half of the battle. The second, much more dangerous half was keeping the money. In Washington state, she reminded him the law was incredibly strict regarding transparency. Lottery officials were legally obligated to release the name and city of residence of anyone who claimed a prize of that magnitude. There was absolutely no provision for individuals to remain anonymous. The moment they walked into the lottery headquarters in Olympia and handed over that ticket, their names would be broadcast on every local news station and printed in every major newspaper by the evening. They would instantly become the most famous people in the state, and that fame would bring a tidal wave of absolute misery. Tiffany painted a vivid, terrifying picture for Jason. She told him that his old creditors, the ruthless men who had funded his failed tech startup and lost millions, were still out there. They had long memories and aggressive lawyers. If Jason suddenly came into $100 million, those creditors would descend upon them like starving wolves. They would file endless lawsuits, freeze their bank accounts, and drag them through years of exhausting litigation to claw back every single penny they were owed. And it would not just be the creditors. Tiffany warned him about the distant relatives, the old high school friends, and the strangers on the street who would suddenly appear begging for handouts, demanding investments, or threatening violence. Their lives would become a paranoid nightmare. They would never know a moment of peace. Jason swallowed hard, visibly trembling at the thought of facing the angry investors he had run away from 10 years ago. He asked her what the alternative was. Tiffany tapped her finger against the lottery ticket, then pointed to the incorporation documents of my LLC. She explained her master stroke. While an individual could not claim the prize anonymously, a corporate entity could. If they claimed the ticket under the name of an established legitimate business, the Lottery Commission, would release the name of the company, not the names of the individuals behind it. She picked up my original certificate of formation. She marveled at the date printed at the top. She told Jason that if they simply created a brand new shell company tomorrow, the lottery commission and the banks would immediately flag it as suspicious. They would investigate the newly formed entity, potentially delaying the payout for months and digging into their personal finances. But Holden Holdings LLC was a goldmine. It was 20 years old. It had a clean, spotless financial history. It had filed years of legitimate tax returns before going dormant. To any bank manager or state official, it looked like a highly respectable, deeply established corporate trust. It was the perfect disguise. Tiffany's voice rose with manic excitement as she detailed the next steps. They would take the ticket to a high-end corporate bank in Seattle, open a new premium account under the name of Holden Holdings LLC, and deposit the winnings. The money would sit safely behind the ironclad walls of corporate privacy laws. They could then use the company account to buy their new mansion, purchase their luxury cars, and live like royalty without anyone ever connecting the sudden influx of wealth to Jason and Tiffany Holden. They would be ghosts, rich beyond imagination, untouchable by the creditors of the past or the beggars of the future. Jason looked at his wife with a mixture of awe and lingering apprehension. He slowly reached out and touched the aged paper of my certificate of formation. He traced his finger along the signature line at the very bottom. A deep frown settled over his face as the glaring flaw in her brilliant plan finally dawned on him. He looked up at Tiffany, his voice tight with anxiety. He pointed out the obvious legal hurdle that stood between them and the $100 million. He told her that the plan was incredibly smart, but it was completely impossible to execute. He pointed directly at my signature on the document. He reminded her that Holden Holdings LLC was a single-member limited liability company. He said that my name was on every single piece of the incorporation paperwork. "But Dad is the absolute sole owner of the LLC," Jason slowly said. Tiffany just smiled wickedly and whispered, "Not anymore." Tiffany reached across the marble island and pulled her silver laptop from her designer bag. She flipped it open, the screen illuminating her face with a pale light. She turned the computer around so Jason could see the display. I leaned closer to my monitor in the dark basement, squinting through the hidden camera feed. The website on her laptop was unmistakably the official portal for the Washington Secretary of State Corporate Registry Division. My heart pounded as I watched her manicured finger point to the center of the screen. She told Jason to read the current registered agent and managing members of Holden Holdings LLC. Jason leaned in, his eyes scanning the digital text. His breath hitched audibly. He read his own name aloud, followed by Tiffany's name. My name was completely gone. The screen showed an official digital amendment filed just 2 days ago. Jason looked bewildered. He asked how she could alter state records without my knowledge. Tiffany laughed, pouring the last champagne into her glass. She explained that we live in a digital age where physical signatures are obsolete. She bragged that everything is online. To hijack a dormant company, one only needed the owner's social security number, date of birth, and basic identifying information to create an access account with the state registry. Jason asked how she got my social security number. Tiffany smiled proudly. She confessed that while I was knocked out on the sleeping pills, she slipped into my tea. She simply walked into the basement and went through my wallet. She stood right next to my sleeping body in the dark basement room, quietly reached into the pocket of my old jacket, took out my worn leather wallet, pulled out my identification cards, and carefully copied down every single sensitive number to execute her plan. Then she went back upstairs, logged on to the state portal, and impersonated me. She checked the digital boxes, forged my electronic signature, and filed the amendment to remove my name from the company I had built. She added Jason and herself as the sole managing members, giving them unchecked digital control. She spoke with immense pride, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was explicitly outlining a textbook case of aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. Down in the damp basement, the shock of her betrayal hardened into pure, calculated focus. I did not panic or yell. My hands were perfectly steady as they moved across my keyboard. With every arrogant sentence that poured out of her mouth, I pressed a specific sequence of keys, taking high-resolution screenshots of the video feed. I captured the exact moment she showed the altered state registry. I captured the malicious gleam in her eyes as she detailed her crimes. I ensured the hidden recording software captured a crystal-clear audio file of her entire confession. She was handing me the nails for her own coffin, and I was quietly hammering them into place. As a former engineer, I appreciated the necessity of structural integrity. A building is only as strong as its foundation, and legal cases are only as strong as their evidence. What Tiffany thought was a stroke of criminal genius was actually a fatal structural flaw. Changing names on a state website might fool a lottery clerk, but it was just a digital facade. I knew something she did not. Corporate ownership is not ultimately determined by an easily manipulated online portal. It is determined by the underlying operating agreement, a physically notarized document safely sitting in a bank vault under my exclusive control. But I was not going to interrupt her. I needed her to keep talking, to keep digging the hole deeper until she could never climb out. Jason rubbed his temples, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crimes his wife had committed. He nervously pointed out that even with the company structure altered online, claiming the lottery ticket would still take time. Corporate payouts for jackpots of this size could take weeks to process. The lottery commission had to verify the ticket, clear the entity, and arrange the massive wire transfer. He told Tiffany that they still had no actual cash. They were currently sitting in my kitchen as completely broke multimillionaires. He reminded her that his former business creditors were still actively looking for him, and if any word leaked out to the public before the money officially hit their new bank account, they would both be completely and totally financially ruined. He pleaded with her to wait patiently for the state to process the winnings. Tiffany slammed her laptop shut with a sharp crack that echoed through the hidden microphones. The sudden noise made Jason jump. She glared at him, her previous celebratory mood instantly replaced by irritable greed. She told him that she refused to wait another month, week, or even another day to start living the life she deserved. She gestured wildly around my kitchen, expressing absolute disgust for the house, her current wardrobe, and the fact that she was still breathing the same air as me. She declared they were not going to sit around acting like peasants when they were holding a piece of paper worth $100 million. She opened her designer bag and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen with sharp, aggressive motions. Looking at Jason with a cold expression, she told him she had anticipated the delay. Rich people do not wait in line, and they do not wait for bureaucratic processing times. She said she had already made a few phone calls earlier that afternoon while he was out picking up the champagne. She told Jason she found a contact who specialized in providing immediate liquidity for lottery winners who needed cash instantly. Jason's eyes widened in fear. He asked her exactly what kind of contact she was talking about. Tiffany smiled, a dark and dangerous look crossing her face. She leaned in extremely close to his ear and confidently whispered that they absolutely could not wait for the lottery payout, but it simply did not matter anymore because she already had a secure contact for a massive bridge loan. The sun rose over Bellevue, casting cold light through the high windows. I had not slept a single wink. I spent the entire night archiving every audio file, video clip, and digital screenshot onto 2 encrypted flash drives. Upstairs, the house remained quiet until roughly 9 in the morning, when the unmistakable crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway broke the silence. I turned my attention back to the laptop screen. My security cameras showed 2 massive jet-black SUVs pulling up to the porch. 4 men stepped out. They were not bank managers. They were not corporate financial advisors. They wore expensive tailored suits, but there was a distinct violent edge to their posture. They carried themselves with the heavy, intimidating presence of men who operated far outside the boundaries of traditional banking. They were private, unregulated lenders. In the construction business, we had a much simpler term for them. They were mobsters. I watched the main kitchen camera feed as Tiffany eagerly opened the front door to greet them. Jason stood nervously behind her, his hands jammed deep into his pockets, looking like he wanted to sink through the floorboards. The lead lender, a broad-shouldered man with slicked-back hair, did not bother with pleasantries. He walked directly into my kitchen, his sharp eyes scanning the marble countertops and the expensive appliances. He dropped a sleek leather briefcase onto the kitchen island. Tiffany offered them coffee, but the man simply raised a hand, signaling her to stop. He wanted to get straight to business. The man unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents. He explained the terms of the bridge loan in a voice that was smooth, calculated, and completely devoid of warmth. He told Tiffany that providing a $5 million cash advance on an unverified lottery ticket was a high-risk maneuver, and the terms would reflect that risk. The interest rate was absolutely astronomical. It compounded weekly, not annually. The penalties for late repayment were financially devastating, and the clauses buried in the fine print essentially allowed these men to seize every single asset tied to the borrower if the lottery commission delayed the payout for any reason whatsoever. Jason leaned forward, his face turning pale as he read the numbers printed on the first page. He stammered, asking the lead lender if there was any room to negotiate the interest rate. The man simply stared at Jason with dead, unblinking eyes and told him that the door was right behind him if he did not like the terms. Jason immediately shrank back, completely intimidated. But Tiffany did not care about the interest rates. She did not care about the predatory clauses or the dangerous men sitting in my kitchen. She only cared about the money. She only cared about instant gratification. She reached into her designer handbag and produced the faded blue folder she had stolen from my office. She proudly laid the forged LLC documents on the marble island right next to the winning Mega Millions ticket. She pushed the papers toward the lender, confidently declaring that the loan would not be held in their personal names. She explicitly stated that the $5 million was being borrowed by Holden Holdings, LLC, a corporate entity with a pristine 20-year financial history. She told the lender that the lottery ticket would be deposited directly into the LLC bank account, making the company the sole beneficiary of the $100 million jackpot. Therefore, the LLC itself would serve as the absolute collateral for the $5 million cash advance. The lead lender carefully inspected the lottery ticket, cross-referencing the numbers on his smartphone. Then he scrutinized the forged state registry documents, showing Tiffany and Jason as the sole managing members of my company. A slow, greedy smile spread across his face. He nodded his approval. He slid the thick loan agreement across the marble counter and handed Tiffany a heavy gold pen. I sat perfectly still in the dark basement, watching my daughter-in-law commit absolute financial suicide. She did not hesitate for a single second. She took the gold pen and boldly signed her name on the dotted line. Right beneath her signature, she proudly wrote her newly forged title, Managing Member of Holden Holdings, LLC. She legally bound my dormant company to a predatory $5 million debt held by dangerous criminals. She shoved the clipboard toward Jason. He hesitated, his hand shaking slightly as he looked at the mobsters, but a sharp, threatening glare from Tiffany forced him into submission. Jason signed his name next to hers. The lead lender inspected the signatures, satisfied. He placed the signed contract back into his leather briefcase. In return, he pulled out a certified bank draft. It was a cashier's check made out to Holden Holdings, LLC, for exactly $5 million. He slid it across the island. Tiffany snatched it up, her eyes wide with manic ecstasy. She traced her fingers over the zeros, completely intoxicated by the sudden wealth. The men packed up their briefcases, gave a curt nod, and walked out the front door, leaving a heavy, dangerous silence in their wake. The moment the black SUVs rolled out of the driveway, Tiffany let out a piercing scream of pure triumph. She jumped into Jason's arms, waving the $5 million check in the air. She yelled that they were finally rich, that they did not have to wait for anyone, and that they were going to start living like billionaires today. She grabbed her coat and told Jason to hurry up. She said they were heading straight to the luxury car dealership in downtown Seattle to buy matching Porsches in cash. Within 2 minutes, I heard the front door slam shut and the sound of Jason's car speeding away down the street. The house fell completely silent. I was finally alone. It was time for me to execute my counterattack. The moment the house fell silent, I did not waste a second. I went to the basement, grabbed the envelope with the encrypted drives, and printed screenshots, and headed to the garage. I walked to my 2004 Ford F-150. It was a faded red work truck with over 200,000 miles. The scratched body contrasted sharply with the pristine luxury vehicles my son and his wife were currently buying with stolen money. I climbed in, turned the key, and listened to the engine. I backed out and navigated the streets of Bellevue, merging onto the highway toward downtown Seattle. The sky was a heavy gray, threatening rain, but my mind was perfectly clear. For 10 years, I had walked on eggshells in my own home, shrinking myself to make room for my son's failures and his wife's ego. I had held on to the foolish hope that unconditional love would fix my family. But listening to Tiffany confess to poisoning me had burned away my paternal pity. I was an engineer looking at a compromised foundation, and it was time for a controlled demolition. The Seattle skyline loomed ahead. I navigated heavy traffic and pulled my battered truck into the underground parking of a high-end commercial building. My Ford stood out parked between sleek Mercedes sedans, but I did not care. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. The doors opened to a spacious reception area with marble floors and windows overlooking the Puget Sound. The receptionist recognized me immediately and made a quick phone call. Within minutes, I was escorted down a quiet hallway to the corner office. Sitting behind a massive desk was Bradley Pierce. Bradley was a razor-sharp corporate attorney in a custom Italian suit. We had history. 20 years ago, Bradley was the legal shark who drafted my contracts and protected my intellectual property. He was brilliant, unsentimental, and loved destroying arrogant people in a courtroom. Bradley stood up, offering a firm handshake and a small professional smile. He asked me what brought me into the city on such short notice. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk, unfastened the clasp of the manila envelope, and dumped the contents directly onto his pristine glass workspace. I handed him the encrypted USB drive first. I told him that the drive contained high-definition video and audio recordings of my daughter-in-law, explicitly confessing to poisoning me with unauthorized narcotics over a period of 2 months. I told him it also contained footage of her committing federal wire fraud and identity theft by hacking into the Washington Secretary of State digital portal. Finally, I explained that it held visual proof of her using my dormant company, Holden Holdings, LLC, to secure a fraudulent $5 million cash loan from an unregulated private lender, effectively tying my corporate entity to organized crime. Bradley's professional demeanor instantly shifted. The polite smile vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a lawyer who had just been handed a massive career-defining case on a silver platter. He plugged the USB drive into his computer, put in an earpiece, and briefly clicked through the files to verify my claims. His eyes widened slightly as he listened to Tiffany's arrogant confession. He took out the earpiece and looked at me, a mixture of professional respect and genuine shock on his face. He stated that the criminal charges alone were enough to put both of them in federal prison for the next 20 years. He said the state portal forgery was incredibly brazen, but ultimately a foolish amateur mistake. Then Bradley reached for the printed photocopy of the quitclaim deed that Tiffany had shoved in my face the night before. This was the document that transferred the ownership of my $2.5 million waterfront home to them for exactly $1. He adjusted his glasses carefully, studying the county clerk's recording stamp at the top of the page. He traced his finger down the dense legal text, scrutinizing every single paragraph and clause. Finally, his finger stopped at the bottom right corner of the document. He stared intensely at the signature line. A heavy, tense silence filled the luxurious corner office. The rain had finally started to fall outside, beating lightly against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with a grim, serious expression. All the aggressive confidence he had displayed just moments ago seemed to evaporate as he tapped his silver pen against the copied paper. He told me that the corporate fraud was easily provable and the poisoning could be handled by the authorities, but the house was an entirely different legal battlefield. He explained that a recorded quitclaim deed is one of the most ironclad documents in property law. It is notoriously difficult to overturn, even with claims of coercion or temporary mental impairment. The county had already accepted it, and the deed was officially public record. Bradley let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked directly into my eyes, delivering the harsh legal reality. "Richard," he said, his tone filled with genuine concern, "I can get your company back, and I can put them behind bars. But looking at this physical document, they have your legitimate signature right here on the line. I have to be honest with you. You might lose the house." I sat perfectly still, absorbing his grim assessment. I looked at the photocopy of the deed lying on the desk. Then I looked back at Bradley. I did not panic or show any fear. Instead, I let a slow, calm smile spread across my face. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk, and looked my ruthless lawyer right in the eyes. I simply asked him if he happened to have a lighter. Bradley stared at me for a long moment. He looked completely bewildered by my unexpected request. We were sitting in the middle of a serious legal consultation regarding federal wire fraud, elder abuse, and a stolen $2.5 million waterfront property, and his client was calmly asking for a fire source. He slowly opened the top drawer of his desk, moved aside a stack of premium embossed business cards, and pulled out a sleek silver lighter. He handed it to me across the cold glass workspace. His eyes narrowed with intense professional curiosity. He asked what exactly I was planning to do with a lighter inside a commercial high-rise building. I did not answer right away. I took the heavy silver lighter in my right hand and picked up the photocopy of the fake quitclaim deed with my left. I held the paper up high in the air, directly between us, making sure Bradley had a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of the fraudulent signature sitting at the bottom of the page. I told him that my son Jason came down to the basement exactly a month ago, crying his eyes out, begging me to sign what he claimed were supplementary medical insurance documents to save his failing business. I explained Jason had deliberately covered the top halves of the pages with a heavy wooden clipboard, showing me only the blank signature lines. I told Bradley that I knew Jason was lying to my face. My decades of engineering instincts had screamed at me that something was terribly wrong with the situation. But instead of fighting him, instead of refusing to sign and sparking a massive confrontation that would only make them more careful and secretive, I decided to play along with their pathetic game. I told Bradley that I walked over to my desk, turned my back to my son, and discreetly swapped my regular ballpoint pen for a highly specialized drafting tool, a friction pen. I flicked the silver lighter. A small, bright orange flame sprang to life in the quiet, climate-controlled office. I held the lighter exactly 3 inches below the photocopy of the deed. I slowly moved the dancing flame back and forth directly underneath the area where my signature was boldly printed in dark blue ink. I explained to my lawyer that friction pen ink is specifically designed to be erased by the heat generated from simple rubber friction. But any source of intense heat will instantly trigger the exact same chemical reaction. I told him that commercial document scanners, the exact kind used by the county clerk's office to digitize heavy volumes of property records, generate a highly significant amount of heat as the paper rolls rapidly through the internal machinery. I watched Bradley's eyes widen as the heat from the lighter hit the photocopy in my hand. The magic happened right before his eyes. The dark blue ink of my signature began to fade instantly. Within 3 short seconds, it completely vanished into thin air, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a perfectly clean, blank white line. I clicked the lighter off the flame disappearing and set the silver medal down on the glass desk. I handed the newly blank piece of paper back to Bradley. I told him that the original document sitting in the county archives right now looked exactly like that. The moment the unsuspecting clerk ran that fraudulent quitclaim deed through their hot commercial scanner to officially digitize it for the public property record, my signature simply evaporated. Without a visible, verifiable signature, the legal document was completely and utterly void. Jason and Tiffany had unknowingly filed a blank piece of paper. The entire deed transfer was entirely invalid from the very beginning. Bradley gently took the paper from my outstretched hand. He stared quietly at the blank signature line for a few long seconds, his sharp legal mind rapidly processing the sheer undeniable brilliance of the physical trap I had laid. Then a low, rumbling chuckle started deep in his chest. That chuckle quickly grew into a full, booming laugh that echoed loudly off the thick glass walls of his corner office. He leaned far back in his expensive leather chair, laughing harder than I had ever seen him laugh. He slapped his hand down hard on the desk, shaking his head in joyous disbelief. He told me that in his entire career as a corporate litigator, he had never seen a client outsmart a fraudster with such cold, calculated precision. He confirmed exactly what I knew deep down. The waterfront house was 100% mine. They had absolutely no legal claim to my property, and any attempt to enforce that blank deed would immediately result in perjury charges. The relief was wonderfully sweet, but it was only temporary. I had successfully defended my home, but the brutal war was far from over. Bradley slowly stopped laughing, wiped a tear of pure amusement from his eye, and leaned forward again. His expression hardened instantly, returning to the ruthless attorney I needed him to be. He told me that the friction pen trick was a masterstroke that saved the house, but we still had a massive crisis on our hands. He pointed a sharp finger directly at the USB drive still plugged into his computer monitor. He reminded me of the $100 million lottery ticket and the $5 million cash loan they had secured just hours ago. He said that while my house was safe, my dormant company was entirely hijacked. Tiffany had legally changed the managing members of Holden Holdings, LLC, on the official state portal. Because of her digital cyber fraud, the government recognized Tiffany and Jason as the sole owners. Bradley crossed his arms, staring at me with a deadly serious gaze. He asked me how we were supposed to stop them from running away with $100 million when they technically controlled the legal entity claiming the prize. I did not lose my composure. I looked at Bradley, noting the genuine concern etched across his face, and shook my head slowly. I told him he was looking at the situation backwards. I asked him to remember 20 years ago, when we first sat down in his old office to draft the foundational documents for Holden Holdings. I asked him what he had insisted was the single most important piece of paper in the entire corporate structure. Bradley stared at me for a moment, his mind racing through decades of corporate law. Then his eyes lit up with sudden realization. The operating agreement, he whispered, almost in reverence. I nodded. I reminded him that while a certificate of formation creates the company in the eyes of the state, the operating agreement dictates exactly who actually owns it, who holds the voting rights, and who has the absolute authority to act on its behalf. Bradley leaned forward, his hands flat on the glass desk, the energy returning to his voice. He explained the beautiful loophole in corporate law that my daughter-in-law had completely overlooked in her arrogant haste. He told me that the Washington Secretary of State online portal is essentially just a public directory. It is an administrative tool used for tax collection and basic public record keeping. It is completely superficial in nature. It does not magically alter the fundamental ownership of a private corporation. Anyone with a stolen social security number and basic hacking skills can log in and change the names on the digital registry. which is exactly what Tiffany did when she stole my information in the basement. But changing a name on a website means absolutely nothing in a court of law without an updated, physically notarized operating agreement to back it up. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I told Bradley that the original operating agreement we drafted 20 years ago, the one that explicitly named me as the sole owner and managing member of Holden Holdings, was not in the faded blue folder Tiffany had stolen from my upstairs office. That folder only contained the standard administrative tax forms and the initial filing receipts from 2 decades ago. The actual legally binding operating agreement signed, stamped, and notarized was currently sitting in a fireproof lockbox inside a heavily secured bank vault in downtown Bellevue. It had never been amended. It had never been digitally uploaded. It was the absolute, unassailable truth of the company, and I was the only person on Earth who had the key and the biometric authorization code to access it. Bradley let out a low whistle, thoroughly impressed. He picked up his silver pen and began writing rapidly on a yellow legal pad, mapping out the devastating consequences of Tiffany's ignorance. He looked up at me and confirmed the exact mechanics of the legal trap. He explained that Tiffany was planning to walk into a high-end corporate bank with the forged state registry papers and the $100 million lottery ticket. She would open a premium account under the name of Holden Holdings and deposit the massive winnings into a fresh account. But because she had not legally altered the underlying operating agreement, she was effectively acting as an unauthorized fraudster, depositing a massive sum of money into a corporate entity that still legally belonged entirely to me. Bradley pointed his pen directly at me and stated it plainly. He said that if Tiffany deposits that lottery ticket into an account under the name of Holden Holdings, she is not hiding the money from her creditors. She is legally depositing $100 million directly into your sole, undisputed possession. The sheer gravity of the situation settled over the room. I thought about the $5 million cash loan she had secured from the mobsters that morning. I asked Bradley what would happen with that predatory debt they had carelessly absorbed. He smiled a ruthless, calculating smile. He explained that since Tiffany and Jason fraudulently represented themselves as managing members, to secure the loan, the contract was completely invalid against my company. However, they had personally signed the paperwork. They had accepted the $5 million cashier's check. They had personally committed massive bank fraud and grand larceny on a federal level. The debt belonged entirely to them, and the men they borrowed from would not care about legal technicalities. They would only care about getting their $5 million back, plus interest. Tiffany and Jason were about to be $100 million poorer and $5 million in debt to extremely dangerous people. I felt no pity for them. They had treated me like garbage, drugged my tea every evening, and tried to steal the roof over my head. They had earned every single ounce of the destruction heading their way like a runaway freight train. I looked at Bradley and told him we needed to make sure they could not withdraw a single penny once the lottery commission processed the payout. I needed the trap to snap shut permanently. Bradley nodded, his eyes gleaming with professional anticipation and a hint of predatory joy. He pulled his keyboard toward him and began typing furiously. He told me we had a very narrow window to execute our countermeasure. We needed to file an immediate confidential fraud alert with the Secretary of State locking the online portal so Tiffany could not make any further changes or dissolve the company. Then we needed to contact the primary corporate banks and the State Lottery Commission, submitting a certified copy of the true operating agreement, along with an official affidavit of identity theft. We had to build an invisible wall around the money, waiting silently until the exact moment they thought they had won. Bradley picked up his desk phone, dialed a secure number, and looked at me with a fierce grin. "We formulate a plan to freeze the trap shut right now," he said. Bradley dialed a direct unlisted number, connecting him straight to the fraud division of the Washington Secretary of State. He did not go through standard customer service channels. He spoke with the sharp, authoritative tone of a man who commanded absolute respect. He provided my name, my stolen social security number, and the exact corporate registration details for Holden Holdings LLC. He informed the senior official that a hostile, fraudulent takeover of the corporate entity had been executed digitally within the last 48 hours. He requested an immediate confidential freeze on the company profile. Within minutes, the official verified Bradley's legal credentials and locked the digital portal. If Tiffany attempted to log back in to make any further adjustments, change the registered address, or dissolve the company, she would simply encounter a generic system maintenance error. She was completely locked inside a digital cage, entirely blind to the fact that the actual owner had just sealed the door shut. The first phase of our countermeasure was perfectly secured, but the digital registry was only the administrative side of the impending battle. The true war would be fought over the actual banking infrastructure. Bradley hung up the receiver and immediately initiated a secure video conference call with the regional vice president of the premium corporate bank where I had maintained the Holden Holdings accounts for the past 2 decades. Over the years, I had deliberately kept a small balance in that specific account, paying nominal fees every month, just to keep the corporate financial history spotless. The regional vice president recognized me immediately when I leaned into the webcam frame. Bradley took the lead. He held up the notarized original operating agreement, the single piece of paper proving my absolute ownership. He informed the executive that my daughter-in-law had stolen my identity-forged state documents and was attempting to launder a massive sum of money. I watched the color drain from the banker's face. In the heavily regulated financial sector, an unauthorized deposit of $100 million, combined with identity theft and a mob loan, is a catastrophic event that can ruin careers. Bradley did not give the man time to panic. He gave him clear instructions. He drafted a legally binding affidavit of identity theft right there on his computer, printed it, and I signed it with standard archival ink. Bradley scanned the affidavit along with the operating agreement and transmitted them through an encrypted portal directly to the bank's compliance team. The instructions were simple but incredibly devastating. The bank was to leave the Holden Holdings accounts completely open and ready to receive incoming wire transfers. If Tiffany and Jason walked into any branch in the state with that winning lottery ticket and their forged state documents, the tellers were instructed to smile, offer them premium coffee, and process the deposit with absolute utmost courtesy. They were to let the massive $100 million transfer hit the account without raising a single red flag. But the moment that money cleared the Federal Reserve and landed in the account, a silent, impenetrable vault door would slam shut. Bradley legally mandated a biometric security lock on the entire corporate portfolio. No funds could be transferred, no cashier's checks could be drafted, and absolutely no cash could be withdrawn without my physical in-person presence at the main branch. I would need to provide dual photo identification, a physical signature, and a live fingerprint scan to authorize the movement of a single penny. Tiffany could put the money in, but she could not take a single dime out. She would be staring at a massive bank balance on a glowing screen, completely unable to touch it, while the heavy, suffocating weight of her $5 million debt to organized crime slowly crushed her. The bank executive confirmed the security protocols were firmly in place. The accounts were armed and waiting. Bradley ended the secure video call and leaned back in his leather chair, letting out a long, satisfied breath. He looked at me, a dangerous glint in his eye, and told me that the trap was perfectly set. The legal foundation was absolutely bulletproof, the financial walls were heavily fortified, and the state authorities were quietly waiting on standby. He handed me the encrypted flash drives, sliding them across the smooth glass desk. He told me that my part of the legal heavy lifting was completely finished. But he warned me that the most difficult challenge was still ahead of me. He said that the law is cold and calculated, but family is emotional and unpredictable. To make this trap work flawlessly, to ensure they walked blindly into their own absolute destruction, I had to completely suppress my anger and my pride. I could not let them see a single trace of the sharp strategic engineer who had just outsmarted them. I slowly stood up from the comfortable, deep leather chair and shook my sharp, brilliant lawyer's hand firmly. I looked him in the eye and told him not to worry about my pride. I had survived a decade in that dark basement, enduring every single insult and sneer. I could certainly survive a few more days of their arrogant cruelty. I walked out of the luxurious office building and stepped back into the cold, gray Seattle rain. I climbed into my battered Ford truck and turned the key, listening to the engine roar to life. The long drive back across the bridge to Bellevue felt remarkably wonderfully different than the drive into the city. I was definitely no longer a terrified, weak victim fleeing his own home in a panic. I was now a cold, calculating predator, quietly returning to the dark nest. All I had to do right now was drive straight home, meticulously pack my cardboard boxes with trembling hands, play the pathetic, entirely defeated old man they firmly believed me to be, and simply wait for them to eagerly deposit my massive winning ticket. I parked my battered Ford truck in the driveway and walked through the front door. The house was already a war zone of their newfound arrogance. Tiffany and Jason had returned from their shopping spree. Empty designer shopping bags and empty champagne bottles littered the expensive living room furniture. I kept my head down, letting my shoulders slump forward to mimic the heavy posture of a completely broken man. I slowly descended the stairs into the damp basement and began to assemble my cardboard moving boxes. I made sure my hands shook slightly as I ripped the packing tape. The loud tearing sound of the tape must have echoed up the staircase because within minutes, I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Tiffany's high heels descending the wooden steps. She stood in the doorway of the basement, holding a fresh glass of expensive wine. She watched me fold a cardboard box with trembling, hesitant fingers. A cruel, satisfied smirk stretched across her face. She did not just want me out of the house. She wanted to break my spirit completely before I left. For the next 3 days, she subjected me to a campaign of extreme psychological abuse that tested every single ounce of my patience. Whenever she knew I was trying to sleep on my narrow cot, she would march up to the main floor directly above my room and turn on the stereo system at maximum volume. The heavy bass vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the dust from the ceiling and making it absolutely impossible to rest. When I slowly carried a small taped box up the stairs to stack it near the front door, she would conveniently be walking down the hallway. She would intentionally bump into my shoulder, causing me to drop the heavy box onto the hardwood floor. Then she would laugh, step right over my scattered belongings, and kick the side of the box with her sharp, expensive shoes. She told me I was moving too slowly. She told me that watching a pathetic old man shuffle around her beautiful new house was ruining the celebratory mood. I played my part perfectly. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single flash of the burning anger inside me. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the ground. I apologized profusely every time she kicked my belongings. I mumbled that I was doing my absolute best and that my old bones simply could not move any faster. My constant submission fed her God complex. She looked at me not as a human being, but as a defeated insect she was slowly crushing under her heel. Jason was no better. He avoided me entirely, locking himself in his upstairs office to browse catalogs of private jets and luxury yachts on his computer, completely ignoring the blatant abuse happening right under his nose. The absolute lowest point came on the evening of the second day. I was carefully packing a fragile porcelain lamp that had belonged to my late wife. Tiffany came downstairs to inspect my progress. She saw me holding the lamp and let out a loud theatrical sigh of disgust. She walked over, snatched a framed photograph of my wife off the desk, and looked at it with pure contempt. She told me that she was glad my wife was not alive to see what a miserable, pathetic failure of a man I had become. She said my wife had terrible taste in home decor, and that the moment I was gone she was going to hire a crew to rip out every single thing my wife had ever touched in the house. She called my beautiful, loving wife a basic, tasteless woman. The urge to stand up, grab her by the shoulders, and throw her out of my basement was almost physically overwhelming. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. The blood roared in my ears, but I remembered the heavy silver lighter in Bradley's office. I remembered the secure fraud alert and the biometric lock waiting at the bank. I forced myself to swallow the bitter rage. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, playing the role of the shattered widower to absolute perfection. I gently took the photograph back from her hands, holding it close to my chest, and whispered a trembling apology. I told her I would be gone soon. Tiffany smiled, thoroughly satisfied that she had finally drawn blood. She turned around and strutted back up the stairs, leaving me alone in the dark to finish packing my fragile memories. By the morning of the third day, the house was buzzing with a frantic, greedy energy. This was the day they had been waiting for. Tiffany had spent the entire night finalizing the massive transfer of funds from the Washington State Lottery Commission. She had submitted the forged state registry documents, the single winning ticket, and the banking details for my dormant LLC. I sat on my narrow basement cot surrounded by taped cardboard boxes, listening to the commotion upstairs. I heard the heavy, purposeful footsteps of the moving crew Tiffany had hired to physically throw me out onto the street. I heard the loud, rumbling engines of the 2 brand-new sports cars Jason had purchased with the stolen mob money idling in my driveway. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and checked my secure email. There was a highly confidential message waiting for me from the regional vice president of my corporate bank. The subject line was completely blank. I opened the email with a steady hand. The message contained only a single encrypted digital statement. I clicked the secure attachment and read the bold black numbers glowing on my small screen. The trap had just been sprung. The lottery headquarters had officially verified the winning ticket, cleared the corporate entity, and processed the massive claim. $100 million had just dropped. The money was in. It was time. I stood perfectly still in the center of the basement, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The glowing screen displaying the confirmed deposit of $100 million faded to black, mirroring the quiet darkness of the room. Before I could process the magnitude of what had just occurred, a deafening roar shattered the mid-morning silence. It was not the familiar rumble of a delivery truck or the quiet hum of a sedan. It was the sharp, aggressive howl of high-performance sports car engines completely out of place in our quiet Bellevue neighborhood. I walked slowly up the stairs, my joints aching in the damp air, and moved toward the large bay window. I pulled back the heavy curtain just an inch, keeping myself hidden in the shadows. Turning into my long gravel driveway were 2 brand-new Porsche 911s. One was painted a glaring metallic silver, and the other was an obnoxious crimson red. The tires crunched loudly against the stones as they sped toward the house far too fast for a residential driveway. They slammed on their brakes at the very last second, skidding before coming to a violent stop inches from the porch steps. This was the immediate result of the $5 million mob loan they had signed for yesterday. They could not wait 24 hours to flaunt their stolen wealth. They had to instantly project an image of absolute superiority. The engines died down, but the chaotic energy they brought hung heavily in the air. Just seconds behind the luxury sports cars, a large, battered, white moving truck turned into the driveway. It blocked the entire entrance, exhaling a loud hiss of air brakes. The side of the truck bore no company logo, just a faded phone number stenciled in chipped black paint. Tiffany stepped out of the crimson Porsche first. She was dressed head to toe in flashy designer clothes that looked painfully brand new. She slammed her door shut and strutted over to the moving truck with an air of supreme authority. Jason climbed out of the silver Porsche looking slightly uncomfortable in a tailored suit that did not quite fit his slumped posture. He lingered by the hood of his car, avoiding looking at the house. The back of the moving truck rolled open with a loud metallic screech. 4 massive, rough-looking men jumped down onto the driveway. They wore dirty work boots, torn jeans, and expressions of complete indifference. These were not careful, professional movers hired to transport fragile family heirlooms. These were cheap laborers hired for a demolition job. Tiffany pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my front door. Even through the thick glass of the living room window, I could hear her shrill voice barking orders. She told the men that everything in the basement belonged to a stubborn old man who was overstaying his welcome. She explicitly instructed them not to worry about being careful or organized. She told them to haul every single cardboard box out of the house and throw it directly onto the front lawn. If anything broke, she yelled, it simply did not matter. The heavy thudding sound of their steel-toed boots hitting the wooden porch echoed through the entire house. The front door was shoved open with such force that the doorknob slammed against the drywall, leaving a deep dent. The four men marched inside, completely ignoring my presence in the living room, and headed straight for the basement door. I stood to the side, leaning heavily on my wooden cane to maintain the illusion of frailty. I watched them descend the stairs. Within seconds, I heard the terrible sounds of destruction. They were not lifting my carefully packed boxes. They were dragging them violently across the concrete floor, tearing the cardboard, and breaking the fragile items inside. The sound of shattered glass and snapping wood drifted up from the dark room where I had spent the last 10 years of my life. One by one, the men emerged from the basement, each carrying 2 or 3 of my heavy boxes. They carried them out the front door, and exactly as Tiffany had commanded, they did not stack them neatly on the porch. They walked to the edge of the manicured front lawn, the grass still wet with morning dew, and simply dropped them. I watched through the window as the box containing my late wife's favorite winter coats tumbled into the damp dirt. I watched another box split completely open on impact, spilling my old engineering textbooks and framed family photographs onto the cold ground. A younger version of myself would have rushed outside, swinging my fists, ready to fight to the bitter end to protect my property. But the man standing in the living room today was a seasoned engineer watching a perfectly designed trap close around his enemies. I did not feel a single shred of fear, anxiety, or panic as my belongings were unceremoniously dumped onto the front yard. The damage to my physical possessions was entirely superficial compared to the absolute financial devastation that was currently waiting for them. Jason remained outside, leaning weakly against his shiny silver car, looking everywhere except at the boxes piling up on the lawn. But Tiffany was not satisfied with just watching from a distance. She wanted to savor her victory up close. I took a long, deep breath, carefully centering myself for the upcoming confrontation. She stomped up the wooden porch steps, her heels clicking aggressively. She pushed past the 2 sweaty laborers and stepped into the main hallway. Her eyes scanned the room until they finally locked onto me, standing in the shadows. A cruel, triumphant smile spread slowly across her face. Tiffany marched straight into the kitchen, ready to deliver the final blow. Tiffany marched straight into the kitchen, ready to deliver the final blow. She did not just walk. She stomped across the hardwood floor with the aggressive confidence of a conquering general who had just won a brutal war. Her face was flushed with a terrifying mixture of adrenaline, greed, and absolute malice. In her left hand, she gripped her expensive designer handbag, the leather creaking slightly under the intense pressure of her tight grip. But it was what she held in her right hand that drew all the attention in the room. It was a massive, tightly rolled cylinder of thick, glossy paper. She moved past the marble countertops, her eyes locked directly onto me. I had retreated slightly, leaning heavily against the edge of the kitchen island, intentionally keeping my hands visibly trembling. I wanted her to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute power one last time before I completely destroyed her reality. She stopped just 2 feet away from me. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, suffocated by the cheap, overwhelming perfume she had practically bathed in that morning. She let out a short, breathy laugh that contained absolutely no joy, only cold contempt. Then, with a dramatic, sweeping motion of her arm, she unrolled the massive cylinder and slammed it down flat onto the polished marble surface of the island. The sharp slapping sound of the heavy paper hitting the stone echoed loudly through the large open concept kitchen. I lowered my gaze, playing the part of the intimidated old man, and looked at the object she had presented. It was not a standard folded bank statement. It was a ceremonial novelty-sized bank receipt, the kind they print specifically for massive corporate transfers or high-profile charity donations. It was completely absurd, a giant physical manifestation of her towering ego. Printed at the very top in bold, oversized black ink was the logo of the premium corporate bank where I had maintained my accounts for over 20 years. Below the logo, the details of the transaction were impossible to miss. The deposit amount was staggering: $63 million. That was the final after-tax payout from the massive lottery jackpot. And right beneath that astronomical number, printed clearly in the designated recipient field, was the name of my dormant company: Holden Holdings, LLC. The money had successfully cleared the state lottery commission, bypassed the federal tax authorities, and landed safely inside the corporate account. Her plan had seemingly worked perfectly. She had successfully hijacked my digital registry, secured a predatory loan to fund her immediate lifestyle, and funneled the greatest financial windfall of her entire life directly into a corporate entity she falsely believed she controlled. Tiffany leaned heavily over the giant piece of paper, placing both of her manicured hands flat against the cool marble to steady herself. She was breathing heavily, practically panting, with the thrill of her perceived victory. Her eyes were wide and manic as she stared at me, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to count to my knees and beg for a tiny fraction of her new empire. When I simply stood there in silence, her excitement rapidly mutated into pure, unfiltered rage. She leaned closer, invading my personal space, her voice rising from a harsh whisper to an absolutely deafening scream. She yelled that the money was finally in the account. She screamed that the waiting was over, that she was officially a multimillionaire, and that I was completely and utterly done. The veins in her neck bulged against her skin as she unleashed a decade of hidden resentment. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and told me to get out of her house. She said that if I did not turn around and walk out the front door right this very second, she was going to call the 4 massive movers back inside. She threatened to have those rough men physically grab me by my collar, drag me out onto the front lawn, and throw me directly into the trash pile, along with the rest of my pathetic, worthless belongings. She said the garbage was exactly where a useless fossil like me belonged. Jason finally walked into the kitchen, trailing several feet behind his wife. He looked at the giant receipt on the table, a weak, greedy smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He did not say a single word to defend me. He did not object when his wife threatened to have me physically thrown into the garbage. He simply stood there, a silent accomplice to the cruelest moment of my entire life. He had chosen the money over his own father. He had traded his basic human decency for a shiny silver sports car and a bank account he did not earn. Looking at him standing there, completely stripped of any moral courage, the last lingering shreds of my paternal hesitation simply evaporated. The sad, heavy blanket of grief that had weighed down my heart for the past 3 days lifted entirely. It was replaced by the cold, clear, calculating logic of a structural engineer. The foundation of their lies was fully built, and the explosives were perfectly placed. The time for acting was officially over. I took a deep breath. I slowly let go of the wooden cane I had been leaning on for the past 3 days. I let it fall to the floor. The wooden stick hit the hardwood with a sharp clatter, rolling away toward the refrigerator. I completely stopped packing. My trembling hands became instantly still. I stood up perfectly straight, shedding the frail old man posture in an instant. I squared my shoulders and looked down at her. Tiffany stopped screaming. She blinked in sheer confusion, entirely unprepared for the sudden physical transformation happening right in front of her eyes. I ignored her completely. I calmly walked over to the coffee machine, picked up the glass pot, and poured coffee. I poured the dark liquid into my favorite ceramic mug, listening to the gentle splashing sound that seemed incredibly loud in the sudden deafening silence of the kitchen. The sheer shock of my physical transformation had completely paralyzed them. I was no longer the hunched, defeated fossil they had been kicking around for the past 3 days. I was Richard Holden, the man who had built this very house from the ground up, the man who had built a successful structural engineering firm from nothing, and the man who was about to systematically dismantle their entire lives piece by piece. The 4 massive laborers Tiffany had hired to throw my belongings onto the front lawn were still standing in the main hallway, peering into the kitchen. They had paused their destructive work, sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere. They could instantly tell that the dynamic of power in the room had violently inverted. I set the glass pot back onto the warming plate. I took my absolute time. I picked up a small silver spoon and slowly stirred my coffee, the metal clinking rhythmically against the ceramic walls of the mug. Clink, clink, clink. Each individual sound was like a ticking grandfather clock, counting down the final fleeting seconds of their arrogant delusion. Tiffany just stood there, frozen, her mouth slightly open, the veins in her neck still visibly bulging from her previous unhinged screaming match, but absolutely no sound coming out. Jason had taken a physical step back, his eyes darting nervously between my remarkably steady hands and my completely calm, unreadable face. He knew me well enough to know that when I got this terrifyingly quiet, when I got this perfectly still, a massive storm of consequences was about to hit. I lifted the mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was hot and bitter, grounding me perfectly in the reality of the moment. I lowered the mug and turned to face my daughter-in-law. I looked past the expensive new designer clothes, past the heavy layers of makeup, and looked directly into her cold, greedy eyes. I did not blink. I did not break contact for a single fraction of a second. The kitchen was so silent, you could hear the rain starting to tap lightly against the thick glass of the large bay windows in the adjoining living room. I let the terrible silence stretch for just a few more agonizing seconds, forcing them to marinate in the rapidly rising tension. Then I spoke. My voice was no longer a weak, trembling whisper begging for mercy. It was a deep, resonant baritone filled with absolute, uncompromising authority. "I am just curious, Tiffany," I began, my words dropping like heavy lead stones into the quiet room. "Why are you kicking me out of my own house right after you so kindly deposited $63 million into my personal bank account?" The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Tiffany completely froze. The smug, victorious smirk that had been permanently plastered on her face for the last 72 hours vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending shock. Her manicured hands, which had been resting confidently on the marble island next to that ridiculous, oversized bank receipt, suddenly went completely rigid. She blinked once, then twice, as if trying to process a complex foreign language she did not speak. Jason, standing right behind her physically, stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the stainless steel refrigerator. His brow furrowed in deep, terrified confusion. He looked at me, then looked at his wife, shaking his head slowly back and forth. He opened his mouth, trying desperately to form a coherent sentence, but his voice cracked in a high-pitched, panicked stutter. He asked what I was talking about. He pointed a violently shaking finger at the giant receipt resting on the table and stammered that the money was definitely not in my personal account. Tiffany finally found her voice, though it lacked all of its previous booming confidence. It was thin, reedy, and laced with the very first genuine notes of pure, unadulterated panic. She took a step forward, leaning aggressively over the marble island, her eyes wide and desperate. She yelled that I was completely insane. She pointed aggressively at the large black letters printed on the novelty check. She told me to read the paper. She screamed that the money was deposited directly into the corporate account of Holden Holdings. She stated emphatically that the corporate entity had absolutely nothing to do with my personal finances. I took another calm sip of my coffee, savoring the rich flavor, completely unfazed by her rising hysteria. I looked at Jason, who was now sweating profusely, pulling nervously at the tight collar of his expensive new suit. I looked back at Tiffany, who was breathing heavily, trying desperately to regain control of the crumbling narrative. She slapped her hand down hard on the giant receipt again, though this time the gesture lacked any real authority. It looked frantic and weak. She declared with absolute certainty that Holden Holdings belonged entirely to them now. She aggressively reminded me that she had gone on to the official Washington state portal. She bragged once again, her voice rising in pitch, that she had successfully removed my name from the registered agent list and added herself and Jason as the sole managing members. She insisted that because their names were officially typed on the digital registry, they were the absolute legal owners of the company, and therefore the absolute legal owners of the $63 million currently sitting in the corporate vault. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to project a solid shield of legal invincibility, but I could clearly see her hands shaking slightly against her designer jacket. She demanded that I stop playing pathetic mind games. She told me I was just a bitter, jealous old man, trying to ruin her perfect day with desperate, completely fabricated lies. She commanded me to pick up my bags and walk out the door right now, before she called the local police to have me forcibly removed and arrested for trespassing on her private property. I smiled. It was not a warm, fatherly smile. It was the cold, calculating smile of a man who had already won the war long before the other side even realized the battle had officially started. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter right next to her ridiculous giant receipt. I reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my faded corduroy jacket. I did not rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had absolutely all the time in the world. I let my fingers grasp the smooth, heavy paper hidden inside. I kept my eyes locked directly on Tiffany, watching the absolute panic slowly begin to fracture her arrogant facade, and I slowly pulled a sleek manila envelope from my jacket. I opened the metal clasp of the sleek manila envelope with deliberate slowness. The satisfying click echoed in the quiet kitchen, breaking the tension like a gunshot. I reached inside the paper sleeve and pulled out the first piece of evidence. It was a photocopy of the exact document Tiffany had waved in my face 3 days ago. The quitclaim deed. But looking at the bottom of the page, there was one glaring difference. I laid the paper gently on the marble island right on top of her ridiculous novelty check. I tapped my index finger on the signature line at the bottom right corner. It was completely blank. Jason leaned in, squinting as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. I explained that when he came crying to me in the basement last month, begging for my signature on fake medical documents, I knew he was lying. I told them I had swapped my regular ballpoint pen for a specialized drafting tool called a friction pen. I watched their faces contort in confusion as I explained the simple chemistry. The ink from a friction pen is designed to completely evaporate when exposed to intense heat. The heavy commercial scanners used by the county clerk to digitize property deeds generate incredible internal heat. I smiled a cold, victorious smile. I told them that the precise moment the clerk ran that fraudulent document through the machine, my signature vanished into thin air. "You filed a completely blank piece of paper," I said, my voice steady and unforgiving. "The property transfer was entirely void from the start. I never gave you my home. I still own this entire property, and you are both officially trespassing." Tiffany violently shook her head desperately, refusing to accept the reality of the blank deed. She stammered and sputtered, insisting that the house did not matter because they still had the company and the $63 million. I reached back into the envelope and slowly pulled out the second document. It was thick, printed on heavy archival paper, and securely bound with a dark blue legal cover. It prominently bore the raised gold seal of a certified notary public. I dropped it onto the marble counter with a heavy thud that made Jason physically jump. I looked directly at Tiffany and told her that her digital hacking skills were impressive for an amateur, but she fundamentally misunderstood basic corporate law. I calmly explained that changing names on the Washington Secretary of State digital portal is merely an administrative illusion. It does not magically alter the actual legal ownership of a private corporate entity. The true absolute ownership of Holden Holdings is dictated exclusively by the original physically notarized operating agreement. I pointed a steady finger at the thick document resting on the table. I told her this was the original agreement drafted 20 years ago, firmly establishing me as the sole owner and absolute managing member of the company. It has never been legally amended. It has never been digitized. Your little digital joyride on the state portal was nothing more than a desperate, easily traceable case of federal wire fraud, I said. You do not own the company. You simply deposited a massive winning lottery ticket into a corporate entity that belongs entirely and legally to me. Jason gasped loudly, taking another clumsy step backward as the crushing weight of the legal trap finally dawned on him. Tiffany's face drained of all its vibrant color, turning a sickly, translucent pale white. But I was still not finished dismantling their lives. I reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a crisp single sheet of premium watermarked paper. It was a formal letter from the regional vice president of my corporate bank, signed and officially dated just 1 hour ago. I laid it carefully down next to the original operating agreement. I read the text aloud, enunciating every single word perfectly for their benefit. The official letter formally confirmed the successful deposit of $63 million into the Holden corporate account. It also confirmed the immediate activation of a maximum biometric security freeze, explicitly requested by the sole legal owner. I looked up from the watermarked paper and watched their arrogant world completely shatter into a million tiny pieces. I explained that the bank executives had been fully briefed on their fraudulent activities. I told them that the corporate accounts were now permanently locked behind an impenetrable biometric wall. No funds could be transferred out. No cashier's checks could be written, and absolutely no cash could be withdrawn without my physical fingerprint and my in-person signature. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the cool marble, and delivered the absolute truth. I told Tiffany that she had done all the heavy lifting and hard work for me. She bravely claimed the ticket she dealt with the massive tax deductions, and she handed the remaining $63 million directly into my secure vault. I own every single penny of those lottery winnings, and you have absolutely nothing left. The heavy silence that followed was absolute. The horrifying reality of their devastating failure hung thickly in the air, completely suffocating them. Jason buried his face in his shaking hands, letting out a pathetic sob as he finally realized he was not a multimillionaire, but a federal criminal facing millions in violent mob debt. Tiffany stared blankly at the 3 flawless documents resting on the marble island. Her grand illusion of endless wealth, ultimate power, and supreme superiority had been violently ripped away in a matter of minutes. Her breathing rapidly became ragged, her chest heaving violently as the pure, unfiltered panic slowly gave way to a blinding animalistic rage. She let out a guttural scream that tore violently through the quiet kitchen. Her eyes rolled back with sheer, uncontrollable fury. Without any warning, she lunged across the wide marble island, her hands curled into vicious claws, aiming directly for my face. Tiffany lunged across the wide marble island, her hands curled into vicious claws, aiming directly for my face. She did not reach me. Before her perfectly manicured nails could even scratch the surface of my skin, Jason finally woke up from his pathetic stupor. He lunged forward, wrapping his arms tightly around her waist, and violently pulled her back. Tiffany thrashed wildly in his grip, screaming obscenities that echoed off the high ceilings, her heels slipping desperately against the polished hardwood floor. She fought like a trapped animal, kicking and scratching at her own husband, completely consumed by the blind rage of a woman who had just watched her entire universe collapse in real time. But Jason held on with a sudden, desperate strength. He knew, perhaps for the very first time in his entire life, that his wife was about to cross a physical line that would result in immediate catastrophic consequences. He dragged her away from the kitchen island, his chest heaving as he pleaded with her to stop, begging her to look at the paperwork, desperately trying to make her understand that violence would not change the ink on the page. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stood there, watching the chaotic, pathetic struggle unfold right in front of me, with the cold, detached observation of a scientist watching an experiment reach its inevitable, explosive conclusion. When Jason finally managed to wrestle her into submission, pinning her against the stainless steel refrigerator, the heavy silence returned to the room, broken only by their ragged, exhausted breathing. I reached into the front pocket of my corduroy jacket and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I did not say a word. I tapped the screen a few times, navigating past the email from the bank, and opened a specific video file. I turned the volume all the way up to maximum and pressed play. The crystal-clear high-definition audio instantly filled the kitchen. It was Tiffany's own voice, recorded just a few days ago, bragging loudly and proudly. The recording captured her explaining exactly how she had been systematically crushing sleeping pills into my evening chamomile tea for 2 solid months. It captured her calling me a useless fossil, laughing about how easy it was to keep me groggy and compliant. Then the audio shifted to her meticulously detailing her digital joyride. The recording played her exact words as she confessed to stealing my social security number from my wallet, while I slept hacking into the Washington Secretary of State digital portal and committing federal wire fraud to remove my name from the company registry. I held the phone up high, letting the undeniable proof of her profound wickedness wash over them both. The fight completely left Tiffany's body. Her arms dropped limply to her sides, and her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror as she listened to her own arrogant confession bouncing off the kitchen walls. Jason slowly let go of her. He took a staggering step backward, looking at his wife as if she had suddenly transformed into a terrifying monster he no longer recognized. The full crushing weight of the situation finally slammed into his mind. He was not just dealing with a failed corporate takeover or a lost lottery ticket. He was standing in a room with a woman who had just gleefully confessed to multiple severe felonies. He knew enough about the law to understand the devastating implications. Systematically drugging a 76-year-old man in his own home was aggravated elder abuse, a crime that carried severe mandatory prison time. Impersonating a citizen to alter state corporate registries was federal cyber fraud and aggravated identity theft. These were not minor misdemeanors. These were massive, life-destroying federal crimes that carried 10 to 20-year sentences in a maximum security penitentiary. Jason's legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, dropping heavily to his knees right there in the middle of my kitchen. He buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing loudly, mourning the absolute destruction of his freedom and his future. Tiffany stared at the smartphone in my hand, her jaw trembling violently. The reality of the situation was a heavy, suffocating blanket wrapping tightly around her throat. She had built her entire grand master plan on the arrogant assumption that I was nothing more than a blind, deaf, and completely defenseless old man. She never once considered that the old structural engineer might have wired his own house with hidden high-definition security cameras. She never considered that every single hateful word, every single malicious plot, and every single criminal confession had been perfectly captured, securely encrypted, and heavily backed up to a secure cloud server. I tapped the screen, pausing the video just as she began to laugh about the mob loan. I slowly lowered the phone and looked down at my son still weeping pathetically on the floor, and then at my daughter-in-law, paralyzed by absolute fear. I told them that the video on my phone was just a tiny preview of a massive, heavily encrypted folder. I calmly explained that a copy of that entire folder containing hours of their criminal behavior was currently sitting on the glass desk of my ruthless corporate lawyer Bradley Pierce right in the heart of downtown Seattle. I let that terrifying piece of information settle into their minds before delivering the ultimate blow. I looked directly into Tiffany's wide, panicked eyes, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. I told her that my lawyer was currently sitting in his office, completely ready and waiting. I stated that he had a direct open phone line connected straight to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and another line connected to the local Bellevue Police Department. I told them that my lawyer was just sitting at his desk right now, waiting very patiently for my absolute final signal to proceed. I looked down at my son. He was kneeling on the hardwood floor of the kitchen, his shoulders shaking with heavy sobs. The tailored suit he purchased yesterday was wrinkled and ruined by tears. Tiffany was immobilized against the stainless steel refrigerator, her breath coming in terrified gasps. The arrogant energy she brought into the room minutes earlier had drained away, leaving an empty shell. The 4 laborers in the hallway had gone completely silent. They were hardened men who understood the absolute finality of what was happening. They did not move a single muscle, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to demonstrate my power. True power is perfectly quiet. It is the absolute certainty of the consequences you deliver. I slipped my smartphone back into my corduroy jacket. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the short distance between myself and the 2 people who had tried to systematically destroy my entire life. I looked at Jason, waiting for him to lift his tear-stained face, but he could not bring himself to meet my eyes. He was drowning in his own guilt and fear. I spoke with a voice that was perfectly calm, smooth, and laced with unyielding coldness. I told them that the time for playing games was completely over. I told them that the grand illusion they had constructed had just violently collided with reality. I stated that I was going to give them exactly 1 chance to decide the immediate trajectory of their own natural lives. I told them I was offering 2 incredibly distinct options today, and they had exactly 1 minute to make their final selection. I laid out the first choice with surgical precision. Option A, I said slowly, letting the words echo through the quiet kitchen. I take my phone back out. I send a predefined text message to Bradley Pierce. He immediately forwards the encrypted video and audio files to federal authorities. Within 30 minutes, agents and local police officers will pull into this driveway with their lights flashing. You will be placed in heavy steel handcuffs, dragged out of this house in front of the neighborhood, and charged with aggravated elder abuse, federal wire fraud, and grand larceny. The evidence is absolutely insurmountable. You will face a highly publicized trial that will completely destroy your damaged reputations. You will be sentenced to 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. And while you sit in the cold concrete cell, I will still forever have my waterfront house, my secure corporate entity, and my untouched $63 million. I let the horrific reality of option A settle deeply into their minds. I watched Tiffany shudder at the word prison. Then I moved on to the second choice, option B. I continued, my voice remaining entirely flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. You tell the 4 men standing in the hallway to leave immediately. You turn around and you walk straight out of my front door. You do not go upstairs to pack your expensive clothes. You do not grab your designer handbags. You do not take a single piece of jewelry, and you absolutely do not ask for a single penny of my money. You walk out of my house right now wearing exactly what you have on your backs, and you never ever come back. You disappear from my entire existence. I told them that if they chose this path, I would tell my lawyer to stand down. I would keep the encrypted files locked away in a secure digital vault. They would keep their physical freedom, but they would be entirely erased from my existence. Jason finally looked up at me. His face was a mask of pure desperation. He reached out a trembling hand, weakly grabbing the hem of my corduroy jacket. He choked back a sob and begged me for mercy. He called me Dad, his voice cracking with a sickening mixture of fear and greed. He pleaded with me to remember that he was my only child. He begged me to just give them a tiny fraction of the massive windfall. He stammered that $63 million was far too much for one old man to spend in a single lifetime. He asked for just $1 million. He said $1 million would be enough to let them start over somewhere else, a small price to pay to save his life. He promised he would become a better son, that he would call me every single day. The sheer audacity of his pathetic request confirmed that he had learned absolutely nothing. I looked down at his trembling hand holding my jacket, and I firmly pulled the fabric away from his desperate grasp. I looked at Jason, and then I looked at Tiffany, who was staring at me with a desperate glimmer of hope that I might finally show them mercy. I crushed that hope instantly. I reminded them they were forgetting one massive, catastrophic detail. I pointed my finger toward the front window, where the two new sports cars were parked in the driveway. I told them they were not just broke. I reminded them of the $5 million cash loan they had fraudulently secured using my company name yesterday morning. I explained that because they personally signed those loan documents and took the cashier check, the massive debt belonged entirely to them as individuals. I looked Jason dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You are not just walking out of here at zero," I said. "You are $5 million in debt to very bad people. And those people know exactly what you look like. They know you do not have their money, and they know you do not have the protection of my company." I took a step back, sweeping my arm toward the front door. "You have absolutely no time. Run." The word hung in the air, echoing off the high ceiling of the kitchen. Run. Jason did not need to be told twice. The primal instinct of survival finally kicked in, completely overriding whatever lingering greed or entitlement he still possessed. He scrambled to his feet, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. He reached out and grabbed his wife by the upper arm. Tiffany was still frozen against the stainless steel refrigerator, her eyes wide and vacant, completely trapped in a state of paralyzing shock. She could not comprehend that her empire of stolen wealth had crumbled into dust before she could even spend a single penny of the actual lottery winnings. Jason yanked her forward with a desperate, uncharacteristic force. She stumbled, her designer heels catching on the rug, and let out a piercing shriek of protest. She tried to pull away from him wildly, swatting at his hands, her voice breaking into unintelligible sobs. She screamed about her clothes upstairs, her jewelry, and the life she felt she was owed. But Jason was not listening to her delusions anymore. He knew the federal authorities were just a phone call away, and the violent mobsters were already counting the interest on their $5 million loan. He dragged her through the kitchen and into the main hallway, her heels dragging across the floor she had just claimed as her own. The 4 laborers hired to throw me out were still standing near the front door. They pressed themselves against the walls to make way for the spectacular collapse of their employer. Tiffany thrashed and wailed, a complete picture of absolute humiliation. Her carefully applied makeup was smeared across her face in dark streaks, and her immaculate outfit was wrinkled from her pathetic struggle. Jason dragged her out through the front door and onto the wooden porch. The cold morning air hit them instantly. Tiffany suddenly stopped struggling and pointed frantically toward the gravel driveway. She yelled at Jason to get the car keys. She screamed that they needed to take the Porsches and drive as far away as possible. I stepped out onto the porch behind them, leaning casually against the doorframe. I cleared my throat, making sure my voice carried clearly over the sound of her frantic sobbing. I reminded them that the beautiful new sports cars sitting in my driveway were purchased using a cashier check drafted directly from my corporate entity. Those vehicles did not belong to Jason and Tiffany Holden. They belonged legally and exclusively to Holden Holdings. I told them that if they even touched the door handles of those cars, I would immediately report them stolen to the local police, adding grand theft auto to their rapidly expanding list of federal crimes. Jason froze on the porch steps. He looked at the gleaming silver and crimson vehicles, the ultimate symbols of their stolen wealth, and realized they were just another trap. He reached into his tailored pants, pulled out the 2 sets of electronic keys, and threw them onto the porch. They clattered against the wooden boards, coming to a rest right near my worn boots. He grabbed Tiffany by the wrist once again and pulled her down the steps. She fought him one last time, screaming my name, cursing me with every vile word she could summon, but her voice was weak and broken. They walked past the scattered cardboard boxes on the front lawn, the debris of the life they had tried to destroy. They walked down the long gravel driveway, their heads bowed in total defeat. They did not have their cars. They did not have their luggage. They were leaving the property entirely on foot, forced to walk down the public street in the cold Seattle rain, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and a $5 million death sentence. I stood on the porch and watched them shrink into the distance until they finally turned the corner and disappeared from my life forever. I turned my attention to the 4 large movers standing awkwardly near their truck. They looked at me unsure of what to do next. The man who seemed to be the crew leader took a hesitant step forward and asked if I still wanted my boxes moved to the curb. I looked at the man and offered a calm, weary smile. I told him that my moving plans had been permanently canceled. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to him for their wasted time. I asked them to please be careful not to scratch my new sports cars on their way out. The leader nodded respectfully, pocketing the cash, and signaled his men to pack up. They climbed into the battered white truck, the loud air brakes hissing in the damp air. The heavy vehicle slowly backed out of my driveway, kicking up loose gravel before shifting into gear and rolling down the quiet suburban street. I turned around and walked back inside my home. I pushed the heavy front door shut and turned the deadbolt until it clicked into place. I locked the secondary latch for good measure. I stood in the entryway and just listened. The storm of screaming, crying, and arrogant demands had vanished. The house was perfectly silent. It was a beautiful, profound silence that I had not experienced in 10 long years. It was the sound of true peace. I walked slowly back into the living room, my footsteps sounding light and free. I walked over to the mantel above the stone fireplace. Resting in the center was a framed photograph of my late wife, her warm smile forever frozen in time. I reached out and gently traced the edge of the wooden frame. The oppressive weight of the last decade was finally gone. I took a deep, steadying breath, looking at her beautiful face, and whispered into the quiet, peaceful room. "We won, honey. It has been exactly 6 months since that rainy morning in Bellevue. The passage of time has a funny way of washing away the bitterness, leaving only the clear truth behind." I never heard directly from Jason or Tiffany again, but my lawyer Bradley Pierce kept a close eye on the legal fallout from a safe distance. The aftermath of their greed was as swift as it was devastating. The private lenders they had foolishly borrowed the $5 million from did not care about forged state registries or technicalities in corporate law. They only cared that their money was gone. Within 48 hours of walking out of my house, Tiffany realized the absolute peril they were in. In a desperate, selfish attempt to save her own skin and detach herself from the massive mob debt, she immediately filed for a hostile divorce. She tried to throw Jason entirely under the bus, claiming he had manipulated her into signing the loan documents. But criminals do not respect divorce decrees. Currently, both of them are living completely off the grid, constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified of every shadow and every knock at the door. They traded a lifetime of guaranteed comfort for a lifetime of endless paranoia. They are learning the hard way that there are no shortcuts in life, and that stealing from your own family carries a devastating karmic price. As for me, I realized that the beautiful waterfront house had served its purpose. It was a fortress that protected me when I needed it, but it was also filled with the ghosts of a broken family. 2 weeks after they left, I hired a proper professional moving crew. They carefully packed my late wife's fragile porcelain, my engineering textbooks, and every single photograph with the utmost respect. I listed the Bellevue property on the market, and it sold for over asking price within a matter of days. I took that money along with a portion of the $63 million sitting securely in my corporate account, and I left the gloomy Seattle weather far behind me. I bought a massive, sprawling ranch in the majestic mountains of Montana. It is a place where the air is crisp, the skies are endlessly blue, and the only sounds I hear in the morning are the wind rushing through the tall pine trees and the gentle flow of a nearby river. I traded the stressful, crowded city life for absolute, undisturbed serenity. Every morning I sit out on my wide wooden deck, drinking my chamomile tea, watching the wild deer graze in the open meadows. The air is so incredibly clean, and the heavy weight that pressed down on my chest for 10 years has completely evaporated. But a man cannot just sit quietly on a mountain with a massive fortune. Money without purpose is just paper. I wanted to turn the ugly, greedy origins of that lottery ticket into something profoundly beautiful and lasting. I worked closely with Bradley to establish a massive, fully funded charitable foundation. We dedicated a significant portion of the $63 million to create a comprehensive engineering scholarship for brilliant, underprivileged young men and women who possess the talent but lack the financial resources to pursue their dreams. I named the foundation after my late wife. Every single semester I receive letters from bright, grateful students telling me how this gift has completely changed their lives and the lives of their families. These young minds will go on to build bridges, design magnificent buildings, and shape the infrastructure of tomorrow. My wife would have been so incredibly proud to know that her name is permanently attached to such a noble and meaningful cause. That is the true power of wealth. It is not about buying sports cars or tearing down houses. It is about building a solid foundation for the future. I have made the incredibly difficult decision to cut Jason out of my life completely. I changed my phone number, deleted my old email accounts, and instructed my legal team to intercept any attempts at communication. It is a terrible thing for a father to erase his own son, but I finally accepted that the boy I raised had vanished a long time ago. He made his choice the moment he stood silently in that kitchen and let his wife threaten to throw me into the garbage. I can no longer carry the heavy burden of his failures or his toxic cruelty. True family is not simply defined by genetics or shared bloodlines. Since arriving in Montana, I have found a profound sense of dignity that I thought I had lost forever in that dark basement. I have built a new family here. It is a family made up of genuine neighbors, honest friends, and people who look at me with respect, not as a useless fossil to be discarded. I spend my days hiking the beautiful wilderness trails, reading quiet books by the massive stone fireplace, and managing the daily operations of the charitable foundation. I finally have the absolute freedom to live completely without fear, without the constant anxiety of walking on eggshells, and without ever being used by anyone ever again. It took a massive betrayal for me to realize my true worth. But I will never forget the harsh lessons I learned during those terrible days back in Bellevue. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and unconditional love should never require you to sacrifice your own self-respect. Sometimes the hardest thing a father can do is let his child face the consequences of their own greed. Do you think I went too far by keeping the lottery money, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Let me know in the comments below. Which city are you watching from? If you enjoyed this, please send a super thanks so I can keep sharing stories like this one with you. Please subscribe and hit the bell.